your illustrious team. I'll come pass you the microphone.
Yeah, maybe we start there because all I could find is just the Fiesta Tech overlay referenced in a staff report for the LD last year. And if you could kind of give us a summary on what it is, yeah.
All right. Fiesta Tech is quite large, as is El Dorado Tech and Continental Tech, which are three of the main PADs up in that northwest corridor. In El Dorado Tech Ordinance 894, which it has subsequent, there's probably a good handful or two ordinances that overlay. There were streetscape requirements, street tree requirements. Some of the PADs up in that area actually limited signage. And so as different parcels have come through, we've encouraged them to purge some of that information because the signage is definitely out of date. Now, some of the streetscape involved, the streets are obviously constructed and it's more of a maintenance and rehab. So I'm going to use Winco as an example up there. When they came in, we said, look, here's your streetscape cross-section that's in your ordinance. If you could, keep the main street tree, which we do have street tree requirements here in the town of Gilbert. Certain streets have certain trees, which coordinated luckily with that PAD. Then you can mix in some others and you can modify, update ground cover and things like that, but the berming in certain areas of grass is required by your ordinance. So because there was an aesthetic theme to some of those areas up there, we did encourage them to stick with it. We didn't say you absolutely have to be identical to what was originally in your as-built, but we said if you could update it but still keep the flavor, we would appreciate it, and it is in your ordinance. So this is the language, and in some cases, there's a little gray area in there that you can wiggle. And so we've tried to work with them to bring it into this century and make it current without limiting them in any way that we had ability to allow for flexibility. So I don't know if that helps a lot, but there are also in some of those, and I don't want to say it's just in Fiesta Tech, I want to say it's in Continental, but I won't swear to that there are use limitations. And prior to 2005, we did allow ordinances to have use limitations. So you could allow or disallow uses. And so those actually make a challenge for staff because every time we get a phone call about, I want to go in here, is my tenant okay? We have a ton of research to do, digging out those old ordinances and looking up. And then some of the terminology isn't consistent with nowadays terminology, so now you get a gray area of which, okay, is my zoning administrator going to have to make an interpretation? Or because like some of them don't allow for car rental. They don't allow for car sales. They excluded Hertz Rent-A-Car. There were certain prejudices at a time that were worked into some of these ordinances. And when we redid the code from the ULDC to the LDC in 2005, those were eliminated, and the direction to staff and in code, it's written, you shall not limit uses. If the use is allowed within that zoning district, it is allowed, end of conversation. So we try to keep updated on our uses and keeping up with the current terminology. But of course, you all know it moves every day with or without us and is very fluid. So, and we are looking into, hopefully in the next year or so, hiring a consultant to look at all of our parking standards. We're doing some LDC update right now that we're just kicking off with a subcommittee, but we've chosen not to modify our parking standards because we think that is truly something that we need to bring in a specialty group in to analyze and look at as we move forward with all these optional vehicle choices and the way people are living nowadays. So we're looking at moving toward that direction, but we're not quite there for the parking scenario.
So I think that the key takeaway, though, is that when you amend the uses, you're effectively amending those PADs because the PADs don't amend the uses, right? The PADs are amending signage, setbacks, landscaping standards. And so as you update the code to have uses reflective of the times, those same uses are allowed in the PADs, except where they are specifically prohibited because they're pre-2005?
In most cases, when someone comes in to rezone in those areas, those PADs are so old that the language from a legal standpoint isn't covering all the bases that we cover in our current ordinances. So in most cases, we don't amend the ordinance. We bring them out of that PAD and create a new PAD, which then puts them under current zoning categories. So they don't necessarily, they wouldn't be keeping those amended use rights. They come into our current code with whatever modifications they want to make, but not with uses. So.
Can I ask a question then? So if you're, I guess you would call it divorcing a PAD, the new PAD then has to meet today's PAD requirements?
Yep. Unless they modify a standard. Yes.
Okay, so as far as like open space, so something that was previously a larger open space spread, is there now, do you ever find that you have a hardship on the new PAD? Because I had an issue in another county where they divorced it, and based on open space requirements or whatever else like that, that new PAD therefore then can basically be open space. That's all it can become, just because of the size and all that kind of stuff. Do you have any issues, or have you seen anything come up? Because that might be something you want to.
We really haven't run into many open space issues. Open space requirements in the old code, I want to say, were 10%. We're at 15 for commercial and industrial uses, and that pretty much once you put your parking in and your setbacks, you're pretty much there. So the only uses that we've had lately for limitations and changes to open space have been multifamily complexes. Some of them in a more urban setting can't meet the open space requirements, but other than that, most people have been able to meet 15 with no problem.
In the PAD amendment, is there a major and a minor to where there's a minor amendment path that's administrative?
Zoning does not allow for that. Zoning is a public process that has to go through a public hearing process with notification. So there's no way to do it administratively like we would do a design review application. We have a lot of different routes that design review can go through with, I don't want to say expedited, but schedules that allow for administrative review or allow for a hearing without public notice or allow, or just at staff level even. But zoning, because it's a public hearing process, we can't do an administrative way of modifying an ordinance.
When you're doing your land development code update, though, you could potentially establish that new major minor amendment process as, I mean, that's your legislative act, where you establish, I mean, most jurisdictions I work in, there is a minor amendment process that does not require a full-blown hearing. And so that might be a way to look at how to amend those antiquated PADs to increase flexibility. For example, if the PAD has an antiquated requirement that now is addressed by code and they want to amend the PAD to take advantage of current code requirements, maybe that's a minor amendment because it's already a town-wide policy that they are now undeviating from. So if the town has gotten more flexible with regard to landscaping requirements or setbacks, and they want to take advantage of that, that might be something to look at as you're doing that land development code update.
We can most definitely look into that, and I'll bring it up at our next legal meeting.
Or even another jurisdiction, they have they're not exactly, it's not written to my preference because the interpretation by staff members changes. So obviously you need to nail it down depending on who's reviewing it. But some of them have things of, okay, a 10% change from land use designation of this to this, or a 10% parking change, or a 10% anything, a 10% change is more, she's minor, it's like administrative, administrative type of amendment.
It's administrative relief.
Yeah, you guys have that in your code
up to
now.
10%, correct.
Right.
And I believe we're limited by state statute. So in fact, I have a circle on that in my research that I'm supposed to go back and double check what state law says.
So one thing on that, just because of difficulty I've had in other jurisdictions, is to clarify that 10% is site plan related versus I've had jurisdictions interpret it as a 10% change in a building, internal, inside the building. And so it could affect things here for like industrial, commercial. In that instance, it was affecting it for multifamily. The building floor plan was the same. Everything was remaining the same, but they were going from a 3-bedroom to a 2-bedroom. We're trying to make a studio or vice versa. And so there was a 10% change in the type of units inside, but does not affect anything outside the building itself. And so because it was like a 12% change from 3 bedrooms to 1 bedrooms or something like that, it triggered a major amendment. Yeah. And so I would just, when you're going through, re-looking at the state statutes or whatnot, just clarifying, because you're not always going to be here for interpreting things the right way.
Ours is written for dimensional, so it's 10% of a dimensional requirement.
Dimensional change?
Of a dimensional, if you have a 10% or a 10-foot setback, the planning manager can give you 10%
Right.
of that. 1 foot.
Yeah. And that's typical. But I think the way that your code is written, there is you guys want to take a hard look at how the PAD is used. I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't argue with your town attorney for what their opinion was at the time about not striking uses, but it's widely done, and it's something that is common in many jurisdictions. So it's something hopefully that can be looked at again, and maybe you can find a path to simplify, create flexibility in what you can do. But I think the key is that the city doesn't want to lose its heavily zoned areas. And I think what we're talking about today is trying to get more uses across the board in those areas. So it's kind of a different conversation than limiting uses. I don't think we're talking about that. We're finding the missing uses and adding them to the puzzle. And maybe you don't even need the PAD to do that, because you're just relying on changing the underlying zoning district permitted use lists, which it sounds like has been the way that you've addressed that. And then as to the landscaping setbacks and what those old PADs require, I think that just the issue for a lot of industrial type owners is that they just don't want to go through a big zoning process. It's just not usually what they do. And so it's a type of a user and owner that is just really resistant to that. I don't know, Jackie, if you've got...
Just comment on the experience there. I've had, actually, one of the owners of the vacant buildings in this area is Clarion Partners. They also owned a building in Chandler that I worked on, and they had to do this, but it was a 7-month process, and I don't know what the total out-of-pocket cost was, but it was several $100,000 by the time they were done with it, between architecture fees for the studies that they were doing, plus attorneys, because they had a zoning attorney and other people that were helping them. So they did it, and it was a complete headache. They ended up selling the property when they were done, because we did some leasing for them, but they were like, get me out of this as fast as possible. So I think if we're expecting the owners to make changes to their buildings and upgrades and try to put more funds into the actual leasing part of it, I think it would go a long way if the town, came to the table and showed that they're going to put in on some of the work as well.
I think based on what we saw with the percentages of violations and issues, and it's clear that the ones who don't want to participate and are, just going at the bare minimums are going to stay that unless they're given that incentive. And the only way to do that is, a monetary or meet them halfway or something. Because, in all jurisdictions, if the land, they'll have weeds, they'll pay the fine, they'll do it when they figure it out. It's kind of just, they still are renting it out, leasing it out. It doesn't really affect them in any way unless they get complaints and they have vacancy. So there needs to be some other like you keep mentioning about the carrot. They need to have something there that makes them, if they, like a lot of them, we were driving through, there's some 70s, 80s architecture, There's no incentive for them to do a facade. There's no reason for them to paint it a different color. There's no reason for them to do any of that things because it's being leased. They're making their money. They've probably been in there for, a dozen or more years. There's no reason for them to do it. And so I think the biggest challenge is going to be for the town to figure out what can we offer this area. And I don't know that even saying, oh, well, we'll waive some fees or reduce your submittal fees to do it, because I don't think they'll come back and say, why should I do it? And maybe it becomes you show them comparisons of places that have done it and show them how much higher their lease rates are or something. It's as in everywhere with our markets. It's a money incentive. So that's, I think, going to be difficult to get those transitions over.
Can I ask a question?
First, you have the mic.
Earlier, you were talking about shared parking, and we have shared parking through an administrative use permit process. But what we've been hearing lately, when we've said to compatible uses where it's off-peak hours, that would be perfectly wonderful, they don't want to share. And they don't want to share because they feel that their financial lender won't support it. They can't resell. It complicates a resell. Therefore, they're not. We can't even sometimes get them to share an entrance. So what suggestions do you have for us when we see perfectly great opportunities, but we just get told flat out no, and there's no way to force them to do it. It's a can you please do it nicely question. And I was just curious what suggestions you may have. How could we incentivize it to get them to be more interested? And to be honest, how can I tell if they're telling me fibs when some of these? Because it's like I can see some of it, but then sometimes I hear a story that it's like, I don't know if that quite flies. But I just, from your experience, what can you suggest on that?
I can suggest Stan.
Well, again, we're in a number of projects where that is part of the equation, and a lot of it depends on how much the apartment developer wants to be there, what they need from the city in order to get the zoning. Because I understand that most of these areas, the city is hesitant to provide the zoning that they need or the entitlements they need. So, it's just part of the process, particularly if it's an area that's suited for it. It can't be, just for the sake of it. It really needs to make sense. And if there's some monetary, cost sharing, et cetera, it could save them some money long term. There's another advantage. So you need to make it, that's both the stick, which is saying, well, if you want your zoning, then you're gonna have to work with us because we need it in this area. And then the carrot, which is, look, we'll help you with some of the costs of the maintenance of whatever parking facility you have. So I don't think you can make anybody do anything. It really just is part of the negotiations.
Unfortunately, it's not even in zoning. It's just in design review, and the
Yeah,
use. They want to say that their use doesn't require that much parking, but our code says it does. But so if you want to offset that, you could share with the guy next door, and then who doesn't need as much as he has. But and I'm going to use an example.
You can't make anybody do anything. Yeah. It's got to, if it helps them economically, that would be part of it. And if it, but I don't think that's true that you can't get it financed or you can't sell it with an arrangement like that.
So that may not be.
Well,
Thank you.
I know of 2 projects where that's part of the equation, and they were financed. So one at SkySong and one at Park Central.
Okay.
Yeah, we do it. We certainly do those easements and all the time, shared parking agreements. Okay. I think the key, though, is in the parking code, there's 2 strategies, right? There's enabling shared use. So if you have a parcel that has adjacent or within a certain distance, like Phoenix will allow you to count parking if the parking lot's within like 300 feet of the building, or whatever it is. So there's that. And then there's the also adjusted parking calculation. Like your user is unique and you have a traffic consultant provide an analysis that justifies that your code requirements don't apply to this particular use. And that's the tool you want to have, especially as we try to predict the future and the role of vehicles. And, if an employer comes in and, they're like, hey, we provide every single employee with a $200 a month credit for Uber to encourage people not to drive. Can we reduce, as long as we have that policy, can we reduce our parking requirement by a certain amount? I think you want to be open to those sorts of arrangements, because I do think you're going to see employers that do have these relationships, these large employers' relationships with the rideshare companies and with those internal incentive programs. And I think you want to be able to reward those programs.
And one last question. From a leasing standpoint, is it better to have an administrative use permit or a parking variance, or to you they're one and the same and it doesn't matter as long as it's in place?
As to when and how parking is allowed as a primary use?
As if you're going to deviate from the parking code and you're going to defer, is there a leasing preference toward a variance versus an AUP?
Yes.
Okay.
So never a variance. You hate to be in that situation saying you didn't cause the hardship and it's not unique. I mean, I never want to do a variance. You also can't lobby the Board of Adjustment, which
Correct.
as a zoning lawyer, I'd like to stay away from. I like to lobby. So, and in the use permit context, that's, it's still an entitlement process that requires some level of notification. There's not a need for that. Like in Tempe, we or in other cities, we do these adjusted parking analyses, which are just the code spells out the criteria. You have to show in that analysis that these criteria are met. And then the planning director has the authority to approve. And so that's the policy statement from the council. They create and delegate that authority to the planning director or the traffic engineer, whoever the person is. And then, it's up to that traffic consultant to then steal. We actually just did this on a case. I do it often, actually. It's very common for these traffic consultants to, explain that given all of these dynamics, the parking ratio should actually be 1/3 instead of 1/9 or whatever it is. And so if you can take out the discretionary approval, the non-city expert arbiter, the conditional use permit, it goes to a planning commission, and this is a very technical, did you meet our requirements or not, versus a bigger policy land use issue. It seems like that decision really better lies with staff and their ability to scrutinize the consultant's work and say, yeah, you accounted for all of the issues. This meets the requirement, rather than putting it up to a political or, a political appointee level. It's technical. It's very technical.
Well, thank you for that
And
input.
I have a question too on those. I wholeheartedly agree with Carolyn. I think that's the best way to do it. It's an administrative process, but especially because I'm not sure. I can't remember how Gilbert does it. Does the use permit go with the land or the use?
Goes with the land.
Okay, because I just want to make sure, because otherwise, in some jurisdictions, it goes with the use, which then voids every time and becomes a giant headache for, users and leasing and stuff like that. So, but I still would prefer Carolyn's method because we've done it several times also in Chandler, and we just get it approved.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Sorry to put you on the spot, but very appreciative. Thank you, guys. Okay, so we're gonna. I know Rory's gotta head out here in a little bit, and so I want to thank you. I want to have everybody provide a parting shot on the panel. What do you see as the most important next step or steps? And we're going to start with our design gurus, big picture dreamers and schemers on the end. So, Rory. And then Stan's going to be brass tacks. It'll be real dry by the time we get down here. So, I'm kidding. Just kidding.
Dream it. If you dream it, it will come. Okay. Big takeaways from today would be code, and code. I really feel passionately and strongly that there is, when you drive through here, there's industrial, and then there's an abrupt single family, and there's one use, and I really think that the town needs to embrace that there's multi-use. It's not just a one-stop shop anymore for one use. So I would really take a look at the way that land is being zoned, usage. And then the other big thing, the big picture would be really determining what Dean and I were talking about having those two endpoints, so to speak, and how do you pick those destination or micro spots in between to create those destinations or those private-public partnerships to create those public amenities to kind of feather and layer the gap between I'll call it the industrial and the single-family home, just to kind of merge the universes, so to speak. So I think there's fantastic opportunities to do that. Small plays, big plays. I think there's a lot that can be said to go big picture. Where are the two end caps, and then how do we fill in between? And I think there's some great partnerships that could come out of that.
Would say treat this animal differently than the rest of the town. It's a totally different animal, and it's older, and give it every chance to thrive. So set the platter in the public infrastructure of codes, drainage, streets, have it all set that it's an enticement for businesses to come or stay.
So not to take away from the brass tacks end of the, oh, okay. So my parting shot would be that, I think we've done a good job of establishing that there is a character here. There is a successful business community here. It is in transition. The area is changing, but I think the market's doing a great job of telling the city, telling what that market wants to, or what this area is becoming. And I think that there are certain things that we've drilled into today that are those great little nuggets to enhance the growth in the area. I think the priority in terms of what should be done next would be to identify a solution for this PAD conversation. I think that until you solve that, really the rest of the conversation is a little premature. You have to be able to figure out how, in order to implement any changes, you're going to have to solve for the PAD overlay.
What they said.
I agree. I'll second that the market's already told you what it wants to do. I would embrace and support all the new development that's happening further south in Gilbert for the distribution tenants that are leaving this area, and be okay with it, and then create some zoning that is going to support flexibility moving forward. And then just one other thing is we've talked a lot about your existing stakeholders and understand their profile, and I still believe that should be a big to-do moving forward, is just go and talk to the people who you value and find out what they want, because I think they'll probably tell you a little bit more about the profile of what businesses could go into this area.
I would say don't push away the businesses that are actively coming and looking to be in this area. Try to figure out how to mold and find a refinement of what is coming in here to what you want it to be, more Gilbert. But I think, like we've been saying, the PAD is a major factor, and which is going to be a huge undertaking, kind of refining whatever needs to be, getting everybody together. But in that time, I think, I can't remember the word, Neely Street again. You could be working on Neely Street and making that attractive to draw in the future and the connector. While you're working through this process, you can have, going hand in hand together and just work it together in one kind of, just like with the Heritage District, it happened overnight, right? It's all going on behind the scenes, and it just kind of pops up at once miraculously. So just going where it's going, but I think you need to clarify and mold what is coming forward. Don't, because if you push it away, then you're going to have people stop coming towards you, and then you're going to be sitting on a lot of vacant property waiting for that perfect piece. I would compare this area actually kind of to, I'm going to draw back to our soccer association. You have your rec players, and you mold them and you grow them into your club team, and your club team gets molded and refined into your college level. You need to have feeder system to keep coming through it and bringing it to. You can't always have these people stay here all the time. You want them to supply the Class A. You want them to grow. But if they want to stay in rec, they can stay in rec. But you need to have that consistent supply coming through. And I think you need to have this area with the secondary and the manufacturing and all that stuff.
I'm going to circle back to the point that it's really not that broken. You know, you've got a 93% occupied area with, you know, good employers. So I think you need to be proud of that. I think there's just some tweaks that you need to do. You need to recognize what the problems are in parking and making it easier for people to solve those problems in one way or another. I really do think that it's very important that you not push back on multifamily development, because I think that is what, you know, 2020 is all about, mixed use, you know, people. And as far as the bike paths thing, I think that's a great thing that really needs to be embraced, but you need to create, you know, people, you know, living options where people will want to ride their bike to work. So I think it's there's some things you need to do, but I don't think I think you can be proud of what you got.
I lied. I had one more thing.
Good.
The thing about grit in this area, it's gritty, and that's okay. Like, gritty is cool. I think the elements of the Heritage District are gritty. It's got all a very open, warehousey kind of a feel in a lot of that architecture. And I wouldn't shy away from the grit, and don't presume that multifamily doesn't want to be there. Because it's being shown all over the place that multifamily does work in concert with older warehouse industrial areas if, you know, done right. So I think that the grit is good in this area.
And the pretty part of it, which is the landscape, that's what you would change. That's your redevelopment. Okay, so thank you to the panel for this today, and thank you to the staff. I was talking to Amanda a little bit. There's been representation, I think, from every single discipline in the town, which I think is a credit to what a cohesive community this is. So that's hats off to you guys. I look like a crazy lady up here because I have about 15 of these, but I have somehow whittled all of that and what we just said down to this. So, okay, so key takeaways for a quick and probably really dirty, gritty, since that's our word, summation. It seems like if we're starting really big, the first thing we need to do that we would recommend is some visioning and planning. Define the vision from a tale of two areas to embrace the change, AKA break the code. I don't know, whatever that new thing needs to be. And then define the plan and locate and identify your partners, right? So you have that big kind of thing to do. And then the second piece, as we're getting more granular, more gritty, is fact-finding and assessments. Identify vacant parcels, identify the parking needs, identify the infrastructure gaps, capacity needs, identify the existing stakeholder profiles, who are the strongest, who are the weakest, who needs help, who can help others. And then the third piece is the public role. And I think we've all said this, the first and foremost is going to be code ordinance amendments to allow for flexibility, as much administrative, permission as possible, and a variety of uses. to allow this area to continue to sustain itself. Public infrastructure, and that comes in the shared pathways, in partnering with SRP, the Neely connection, the road to heritage. I think we need, you want the path to the people. Think about what that looks like. And then I think you launch your famous Gilbert social media campaign to pre-sell all this, the public role. And then the last but not least, because we're all up here, is the private role and responsibility. And how to incentivize the market. The market has already made the change, right? So we're saying embrace that change and then incentivize that change, that market, to do the right thing. Building improvements, redevelopment of setbacks, what are the missing uses, multifamily. There was, I think Jackie mentioned hospitality. What's the private sector's responsibility with the existing absentee landowners? Is there a way to incentivize and not penalize, but prohibit bad behavior from continuing? So I think, all of that is you're acknowledging that this area has so much more opportunity and that it's already leading the way for the community. So that's it. Anything from anyone? Thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you to the panel.
Thank you all so much for your time. This has been really beneficial and just such a great dialogue. And thank you to our staff who is here as well listening today. We appreciate you. Thank you all.